About 60 yards away, a gas station attendant worked his entire shift. He heard nothing. A few dozen yards in another direction, a family was hosting a backyard barbecue. Food on the grill, kids running around, people talking over one another. Not one of them heard a scream. Not one of them saw a thing, and in the hours that followed, other people walked down that same path, passing within a few yards of where she lay hidden in the tall grass. None of them noticed anything was wrong. No screams, no struggle anyone heard, no witness, no weapon, no name. Just a quiet suburb, a summer afternoon, and a 15-year-old girl who went out for a candy bar and never came home. And I'll tell you up front, this case was solved. The man who did it is in prison right now. But how they found him and who paid the price along the way is why this story is worth the next 40 minutes. For 30 years, this case sat unsolved. The killer was no mastermind, and the police never quit on it. The problem was timing. The crime landed inside a strange gap in history, a window when investigators could collect the one piece of evidence that would eventually identify the killer, but had no way to read it. And here's the part of this story that stays with you. The law that finally caught this man, the one that forced his DNA into a database, was championed by a prosecutor from the very county where this murder happened, partly because of this exact case. In a way you'll understand by the end of this video, Kristy Wesselman helped catch her own killer. It just took 3 decades. This is the story of what happened on that path, of the innocent man whose life was destroyed along the way, and of the single, unrelated arrest 150 miles away that finally ended it all. Glen Ellen, Illinois. Summer of 1985. A quiet, comfortable suburb about 25 miles west of Chicago, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's kids by name, and nobody thought twice about a teenager walking to the store alone. Because why would they? Nothing ever happened there. That was the whole point of living there. Kristy Wesselman was 15. She lived with her mother, Sandy, her 2 older brothers, and her sister. By every account, she was the kind of kid other parents pointed to. A popular athlete at Glenbard South High School, president of her freshman class, already chosen to lead her sophomore class. She played volleyball and basketball, and spent her free hours outside with friends. That summer, she was taking classes at school. Sunday, July 21st, 1985. Kristy came home in the mid-afternoon, around 3:30. She and her mom had planned to spend the rest of the day together watching old movies. Sandy asked her to run to the Jewel grocery store near Butterfield Road for some candy. The store was close enough that the trip should have taken minutes. Kristy wanted a soda for herself, and as her daughter went out the door, Sandy said 6 words to her. "Be careful, princess. I love you." She had no way of knowing they were the last words she would ever say to her daughter. Think about how ordinary that is. A teenager on a summer Sunday walking to the store for candy for an afternoon of old movies with her mom. It is the single most unremarkable errand a kid can run. Sandy expected her back in a few minutes. Between the Wesselmans' neighborhood and the store sat a large vacant lot, a field of tall prairie grass. Driving around it was easy if you had a car, but if you were a kid on foot, you did what every kid in the area did. You took the shortcut. Years of teenagers cutting through to the Jewel and the McDonald's had worn a narrow dirt path straight through the grass. Everyone used it. Kristy had walked it countless times. The neighborhood on the other side of that grass was called Valley View, the kind of subdivision where families stayed for decades, where the same kids who wore that path into the dirt would grow up, buy houses, and still be living there 30 years later. Hold that thought about the neighborhood. This story isn't only about one family. At around 4 p.m., she reached the store. A security camera caught her standing in line, the last images of Kristy alive. The clerk behind the counter knew her. He lived nearby, and he'd actually babysat her when she was younger. That's the kind of town this was. He'd remember later that she bought her candy bars, that she seemed happy, that absolutely nothing about her seemed off. She paid, she left, and she started walking home. She was last seen on that well-traveled path, heading back toward her house. She never made it. Now put yourself in Sandy Wesselman's kitchen that evening. At first, there's no alarm at all. It's 1985. There are no cell phones. No way to text, "Where are you?" Kids lose track of time. Kristy probably ran into friends. She'd walk through the door any minute with some story about who she bumped into. But the minutes became an hour. The hour became evening, and that low hum of unease every parent knows started to grow into something else. Sandy began calling Kristy's friends, one by one, working the rotary of names. Nobody had seen her. Not at the store, not around the neighborhood, not anywhere. And each call made it worse, because each call eliminated an innocent explanation. By full dark, this was no longer a mother's worry. It was a family operation. Kristy's brothers went out into the neighborhood. Neighbors joined. Flashlight beams moved along the edges of yards, and every pair of headlights that turned onto the street carried a half-second of hope that died as the car rolled past the house. If you've ever waited for someone who is late in a way that feels wrong, you know the physics of that night. Time simply moves slower inside that house than it does anywhere else. So Sandy did the only thing left. She walked the route herself. Out the door, down the streets toward the Jewel, scanning yards and sidewalks and parking lots for any sign of her daughter. Nothing. The family kept searching into the night. Brothers, neighbors, anyone who could help. And at 1:50 in the morning, that oddly specific time that tells you exactly how long a mother will hold out hope before she can't anymore, Sandy called the police. Officers responded quickly and started rebuilding Kristy's last known movements. The clerk confirmed the 4 p.m. visit. A few other witnesses remembered seeing her at the store, but after she walked out that door, the trail simply stopped. Her friends were re-interviewed. None of them had seen her all day. Officers combed the streets in the dark, but a nighttime search of a suburb, with no starting point and no direction of travel, is close to hopeless. By morning, there was nothing. No sightings, no belongings, no leads. A 15-year-old girl had walked out of a grocery store in daylight and vanished somewhere in the 5 minutes between the Jewel and her front door. And if you know this genre, you know that sentence usually hides an explanation. A secret boyfriend, trouble at home, a runaway plan. Investigators looked for all of it. There was nothing to find. Kristy Wesselman's life had no dark corner for this to have come out of, which meant the dark had come from somewhere else entirely. Late that morning, Monday, July 22nd, a fresh group of officers rotated onto the search, and one investigator asked the question that should have been asked 12 hours earlier. What route would she actually have taken? Not the route an adult would drive. The route a 15-year-old on foot would walk. The shortcut. The worn dirt path through the field of tall grass. He started down the trail, the grass standing well overhead in the July heat, walking the same line Kristy would have walked with her soda and her candy bars. And partway along the path, something off to the side caught his eye, a disturbance in the grass, a few yards off the trail. He pushed through the overgrowth. At about 11:15 a.m., roughly 19 hours after Kristy left the store, the search ended in that field. He recognized her almost immediately. He called for backup. The field was sealed off, and the case changed from a missing person to a homicide. Word traveled the way it does in a place like that. A squad car at the field, then two, then the tape going up, then phones ringing along the block. For the Wesselmans, 19 hours of not knowing collapsed into the one piece of knowledge no family wants. And for a subdivision full of parents whose kids used that shortcut every day, something quieter but permanent happened that afternoon. The field stopped being a shortcut. It became the field. Pause on that scene, because its geography is the engine of this entire mystery. Kristy's body was just a few yards off a path that people used constantly. The tall grass had hidden her from view. Searchers and pedestrians had likely passed within feet of her. The barbecue was within earshot. The gas station attendant was 60 yards away. This wasn't a killer who dragged his victim to some remote location. He attacked her in the middle of everything, surrounded by people, and somehow generated no witnesses at all. The medical examiners determined that Kristy had died from at least 8 stab wounds. There was also evidence that she had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. I'm going to keep the details clinical, out of respect for her and her family, but one fact from the autopsy matters enormously. Investigators were able to collect the attacker's biological material. Now, here is the cruel irony of the year 1985. Forensic science had advanced just far enough to know that this material was worth collecting and preserving. But DNA profiling, the technology that could actually read that evidence and point to one human being on Earth, was in its infancy. The first criminal conviction using DNA anywhere in the world was still 2 years away. American police had no databases, no protocols, no labs for it. So investigators did the only thing they could do. They sealed the evidence and stored it. A letter to the future, filed in a drawer, with no idea if anyone would ever be able to read it. I want to give that decision its due because it's easy to miss. Somebody in 1985 made a completely unglamorous choice. Label the evidence, seal it, shelve it, keep the chain of custody clean for a technology that did not exist yet. No press conference ever celebrates the person who does that. And there are thousands of cases from the late 70s and 80s sitting in exactly this limbo. Evidence collected, but unreadable at the time. Every one of them that ever gets solved the same way, because someone did the boring thing correctly, decades before it mattered. Beyond that, the crime scene gave them almost nothing. No usable footprints, no weapon, none of the killer's belongings. Kristy's family also told police about one more haunting detail. A ring she'd been wearing that day was missing. Not on her, not at the scene. Detectives quietly flagged local pawn shops in case it ever surfaced, and near her body, searchers found something small that tells you everything about how fast this happened. A half-eaten candy bar. The errand she left home for, interrupted mid-bite. Let's deal with the question that tormented investigators, because it's the question you're probably asking right now. How does someone commit a violent murder yards from a footpath, 60 yards from a gas station, within earshot of a family barbecue, and nobody hears a scream? Detectives went door to door, and every conversation ended the same way. The people who'd walked that path around the time of the attack saw nothing, heard nothing. The barbecue guests, one by one, nothing. The gas station attendant, who'd worked his entire shift 60 yards away, nothing. A dozen ordinary Sunday afternoons, all of them missing the same 5 minutes. Detectives weighed 3 grounded explanations. 1. Speed. An ambush attack from behind, which is what prosecutors would eventually describe, can be over in seconds, before a victim fully understands what's happening. And tall, dense grass swallows both sight and sound better than people realize. 2. Ambient noise. A summer Sunday afternoon in the suburbs is not silent. Lawnmowers, traffic on Butterfield Road, a barbecue full of talking, laughing people. A brief sound from a field can disappear into all of that without anyone's brain registering it as unusual. 3. The theory police initially favored, that Kristy knew her attacker and went into the grass without alarm, which would explain the absence of any commotion. It was a reasonable theory. This was a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone. It was also completely wrong, and that wrong assumption, logical as it was, quietly shaped the next several years of the investigation and helped destroy an innocent man's life. Because among the doors detectives were already knocking on was a house whose backyard sat roughly 100 yards from where Kristy was found. Hold on to that door. We're coming back to it, because what happens behind it is the second tragedy of this story. Working from the theory that the killer was local, detectives built lists. Every man who knew Kristy, every man in the area with a history of violent offenses. They ran down tips, cleared suspects, and ran down more tips. Months of this stretched into years, and every lead ended the same way: nowhere. Then, in 1988, the science finally caught up. DNA analysis was emerging as a real investigative tool in the United States, and detectives went back through everyone who had ever been a person of interest in Kristy's case and asked for samples. Most agreed. One by one, they were compared against the preserved evidence. One by one, they were cleared. But one man refused. His name was Dana Henry. That house near the field, the one I told you to hold on to, belonged to his mother. That backyard, 100 yards from where Kristy was found, was the reason he'd been on the police's radar from day one. That was it. That was the entire connection. Proximity. Henry said police never even told him why he was under suspicion. He had to work it out for himself, like a riddle about his own life. The field, the body, his mother's yard. 100 yards of grass was the entire case against him. Henry maintained from day one that he had nothing to do with the crime. He would later say he had never even met Kristy Wesselman. But then the DNA sweep came in 1988, and he refused to volunteer a sample. That refusal transformed him, in the eyes of investigators and eventually the public, from a man near a crime scene into the man. I want to stop and ask you something directly, because reasonable people genuinely disagree here. If you're the detective, what does a refusal mean to you? Is it the behavior of a guilty man, or is it exactly what a free citizen is entitled to do? Decline to hand his genetic code to the government when he's done nothing wrong? Think about your honest answer, and then watch what happened to him. Police sought a court order to compel his DNA. Henry showed up to the hearing still insisting on his innocence and ended up held for contempt of court. By his own account, he was held in a jail cell, at one point stripped of his clothing, until the pressure broke him and he agreed to give blood and saliva samples. The samples were tested against the killer's DNA. They did not match. Dana Henry was innocent. Factually, scientifically, conclusively innocent. But here's the thing about suspicion in a small town. Science can clear your name, and the whispers keep going anyway. Henry said he spent around $50,000 on legal fees, an enormous sum in the late 80s. He mortgaged his home to pay for it and eventually lost the house. Friends fell away. Family members turned their backs. He filed a lawsuit against the police department. It went nowhere. And even after the DNA exclusion, some neighbors still believed he'd done it. Years later, he summed up the aftermath in one devastating line. For 30 years, he said, he'd had exactly two settings: angry and depressed. He eventually left the area entirely and rebuilt what he could in another county. But think about what his story means for everyone else in this video. Every hour detectives spent compelling, jailing, and testing Dana Henry was an hour spent on a man whose only crime was where his mother lived. Meanwhile, the actual killer rode a motorcycle through a world with no reason to ever look at him. That's the real cost of tunnel vision. It wrecked the man inside the tunnel, and the whole time it was quietly protecting the man outside it. Remember Dana Henry. He comes back at the very end of this story, and what happens to him, or rather what doesn't, might be the part of this case that stays with you longest. Through the 1990s, the case went cold in the truest sense. The original detectives retired or moved on. The file passed to new hands. Sandy Wesselman eventually moved away from Illinois, carrying the case with her. Cold case detectives sometimes describe files like this one as breathing documents. Never closed, never active, just waiting. Kristy's file waited on a series of desks while the world around it changed. The jewel closed, the field's edges filled in. The kids of Valley View became parents themselves. But cold never meant forgotten. On the day she buried her daughter, Sandy had made a silent promise. The search for Kristy's killer would never be allowed to fade. And in 2011, on the 26th anniversary, detectives revealed a secret they had been keeping for 2.5 decades: the ring. Police had deliberately never disclosed it, because a detail only the killer could know weeds out false confessions and clears the innocent. Now they described it publicly for the first time: a gold family heirloom, size 4.5, set with a chipped pearl. They announced a $10,000 reward, canvassed the 120 residents who'd lived in the neighborhood since 1985, and speculated openly that the killer might have kept the ring to remember what he did. 25 fresh leads came in that year. None of them was the answer. Standing at that podium, 26 years in, Sandy told the cameras there was a man out there who believed he had gotten away with murder. "Please help us take away his dream," she said. "He stole all of Kristy's." Then, in 2000, investigators did something quietly momentous. The DNA profile developed from the evidence collected at Kristy's autopsy was uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. 30 seconds on how this works, because it's the key to everything that follows. CODIS is essentially a matching engine with two sides. On one side, DNA profiles from crime scene evidence entered by police agencies. On the other, DNA profiles from known individuals, people convicted of, or in many states arrested for, qualifying offenses. The system continuously compares the two sides. When a crime scene profile and an offender profile line up, it fires off a notification called a hit. So when Kristy's case was uploaded in 2000 and no match came back, it didn't mean the system had failed. It meant something more specific and, in hindsight, more chilling. Whoever killed her was not in the offender database. His profile had simply never been collected. So investigators turned the search into a ritual. The profile wasn't submitted once and forgotten. It was run against the database again and again as new offender profiles poured in, week after week, year after year. Somewhere in Illinois, on a schedule, a computer kept asking the same silent question: is he in here yet? And week after week, for 15 years, the answer came back no. The letter from 1985 had finally been opened. It was legible. It named exactly one man on the planet. But that name was written in a language of 13 genetic markers, and there was nothing to compare it against. The trap was set. Now it just had to wait for him to walk into it. One more thing before we jump forward. Near the end of this story, a man in a jail cell is going to write 5 words on a styrofoam coffee cup. 5 words. 30 years in the making. Remember the cup. Here is where this story does something almost no cold case ever does. It starts to bend back on itself. In 2002, Illinois passed a law dramatically expanding DNA collection. It required samples from a far wider pool of offenders than ever before, so that the offender side of that CODIS database would actually fill up with the people most likely to have committed unsolved crimes. One of the driving forces behind that legislation was the state's attorney of DuPage County, Joe Burkett. DuPage County, the same county where Kristy Wesselman was murdered. And among the unsolved cases weighing on that office, the case that helped fuel the push for the law was Kristy's. Sit with that. A prosecutor, haunted by a murdered 15-year-old whose killer's DNA was sitting in a database with nothing to match it against, helps pass a law designed to force offenders' DNA into that database. Nobody involved could have known it at the time, but they had just built the exact mechanism that would one day solve the case that inspired it. All it needed was for the killer to break the law one more time. Any law, anywhere in Illinois. And Burkett never treated that as a long shot. Years later, he'd explain the office's thinking plainly. A crime like this is not committed by a man with no history. Whoever did it had a record behind him or a record ahead of him, and either way, they always believed time and the database would eventually catch up with him. He held out for 13 more years. 2015, Champaign, Illinois, a city about 150 miles south of Glen Ellen. A 62-year-old man is arrested after a domestic violence incident involving his wife. It's the kind of arrest that happens every day in every county in America. Local charge, local court. In July 2015, he pleaded guilty to felony domestic battery. And here is the detail that should stop you. He wasn't even sent to prison for it. He got a year of probation, with one bureaucratic requirement stapled to the paperwork: provide a DNA specimen. That requirement existed because of the 2002 law. His profile was processed and uploaded into the offender side of CODIS. Somewhere in a lab, the matching engine did what it had been silently doing for 15 years. It compared the new profile against every unsolved crime scene profile in the system. And on September 10, 2015, 30 years after a girl walked into a field with a soda and a candy bar, detectives in DuPage County received the notification that 3 generations of investigators had waited for. Hit. The crime scene profile from the 1985 murder of Kristy Wesselman matched a man named Michael R. Jones. Detectives pulled everything they could find on him, and the first discovery was the most unsettling one. They had never heard of him. In 30 years and thousands of pages of case file, his name appeared exactly nowhere. He had never been a suspect or a witness. No tip ever carried his name. No rumor, not even a note scribbled in a margin of the file. Every theory the original investigators had built, the local man, the acquaintance, someone Kristy knew and trusted, had been wrong from the first day. The killer was a stranger who had passed through their world like weather, and no investigation on Earth, in 1985, could have found him. By the way, if this story is worth your time so far, consider subscribing. Most of you watching right now aren't, and cases like this take weeks to research properly. Now, back to it. Because who Michael Jones turned out to be is worse than anyone imagined. Now detectives started pulling records. And this is the part of the video where I need you to track the dates carefully, because the timeline is the tragedy. Michael Jones had a history of violence against women stretching back to the mid-1970s, including convictions for raping 2 women during that decade. In 1977, in Cook County, he attacked a 27-year-old woman named Jerry Michael. The account prosecutors later gave is chilling in its premeditation. He struck her with his car while she was riding her bicycle, manufacturing the encounter. Then he restrained her, took her to his home, assaulted her, and afterward left her at a hospital parking lot. When a warrant was issued, he turned himself in. At trial, he expressed deep remorse, told the court he had great respect for the law, and claimed he was struggling with serious mental health problems. An independent psychiatric evaluation found he was fully aware of his actions. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. He served 6, released early, back on the streets by 1983. His victim was never notified of his release. She would say later that if she had known, she would have fought it with everything she had. Don't lose the name Jerry Michael. Near the end of this story, she is going to be sitting in a courtroom gallery, and what she says there is the closest thing this whole case has to a final verdict. Not on Michael Jones, but on the system that freed him. Now do the arithmetic with me, because this is the part that should make you angry. If Michael Jones had served even the minimum of his sentence, the 10 years, not the 20, he would have been behind bars until at least 1987. Kristy Wesselman was murdered in July of 1985 by a man who was out on parole from that very case. 2 years of freedom he was never supposed to have. That is the margin this entire story turns on. Kristy's mother would eventually say it plainly at the end of all this. One of Jones's earlier victims stood up and said the same thing. Had he served his time, we would not be here. So why did he never surface in the investigation? The detectives pieced together a probable answer. Jones took long, solo motorcycle trips and regularly traveled to visit relatives in the Chicago area, routes that could carry him right past Glen Ellen. If he was simply passing through for a few hours on the day of the murder, he would have been effectively invisible. No local ties, no local record, no reason for anyone in DuPage County to ever say his name. A predator intersecting a footpath for one afternoon and then gone. This, by the way, is why stranger murders are the hardest cases in all of homicide work. Almost everything detectives do, victimology, known associates, motive, assumes a connection between killer and victim. When there is no connection, the entire toolbox points at innocent people. In this case, it pointed at Dana Henry. His ex-girlfriend filled in the rest of the picture. A man with a hair-trigger temperament, calm one moment and enraged the next. And, disturbingly, a man obsessed with detective novels and true crime shows. A man who studied, as entertainment, exactly how people like him get caught. Investigators couldn't help but wonder what else might be sitting in cold case files along those motorcycle routes. That question has never been fully answered. To be clear about what's known and what isn't, no other case has ever been publicly tied to him, but detectives are not in the habit of believing that a man commits violent crimes through the 70s, a murder in the 80s, and then simply behaves himself for 30 years. The honest status of that question is open. Before anyone said a word to the public, investigators moved carefully. A database hit is a lead, not a conviction. The sample has to be confirmed. On September 18, 2015, they obtained a warrant and collected a fresh, directly witnessed DNA sample from Jones. It confirmed the match. The odds of error were, for all practical purposes, 0. When investigators showed Jones a photograph of Kristy, his answer was as bold as it was false. "As God is my witness, I've never seen her before." His DNA said otherwise. Then came the moment this had all been for. Sandy Wesselman had, by then, moved out of state. Over 30 years, police had called her many times, follow-up questions, routine check-ins, tips that went nowhere. When they'd recently asked her about a name she'd never heard, Michael Jones, she didn't think much of it. Just another call. This time, there was no call. 2 DuPage County Sheriff's deputies got on a plane and flew to Colorado to stand in front of her and tell her, in person, face to face, "We found him. It's over." 30 years of phone calls, and the answer finally arrived at her door. Jones was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of aggravated criminal sexual assault. The announcement hit DuPage County with the force of 30 years of waiting. At the press conference, Kristy's brother Bill stood in front of the cameras and compressed 30 years into a few plain words. Shock and awe, he called the feeling. The family had been waiting for news like this for 3 decades, he said, and it had finally come. After all those years, it was something just to have a face to look at in a courtroom. And remember what I told you about Valley View, that the kids who wore that path into the grass would still be there decades later. They were. Grown now, with children of their own, they had carried this case their entire lives. One of them described what July 1985 had actually done to the neighborhood. It taught an entire subdivision, in a single day, that this sort of thing does not only happen to other people. For 30 years, they had walked and driven past that field. Now, finally, it had a name attached to it. He denied everything. He was held without bond, and the machinery of justice began to grind slowly. Pre-trial motions, defense challenges to the DNA handling, delays. The case inched along for more than 2 years. And then, in January 2018, days before trial, everything collapsed at once. Prosecutors revealed a piece of evidence they were prepared to introduce alongside the DNA. And here is the cup I told you to remember. In jail, on a styrofoam coffee cup, Michael Jones had written 5 words: "I'm sorry for 1985." Facing the DNA, the cup, and a possible life sentence, Michael Jones pleaded guilty to murdering Kristy Wesselman on January 18, 2018, with formal sentencing set for the following Tuesday. As part of the plea, he was never required to explain himself. No account of that afternoon, no answers for the family, nothing. Whatever happened on that path in the tall grass, the only living person who knows has chosen to keep it. At the sentencing hearing in Wheaton, Sandy Wesselman, now 78 years old, delivered an 11-minute victim impact statement. She looked at the man who killed her daughter exactly once. And in the gallery sat 2 women who had been waiting even longer than the Wesselmans. Judy Van Kirk, who survived an attack by Jones in the 1970s, said afterward that he had finally gotten what he deserved. Her only regret was that it hadn't come sooner. And beside that story sat the other one, Jerry Michael, the woman from 1977, the victim of the very case Jones was on parole from when he killed Kristy, the woman nobody told when he walked out of prison early. I said her words would feel like the final verdict on the system, and here they are. If Michael Jones had served even the 10-year minimum of his sentence, she said, none of them would have been in that courtroom at all. Earlier, I asked you to do the arithmetic on his early release, but understand, I wasn't the first one to do that math. She was. She's been doing it for 40 years. That Tuesday, Judge George Bacalus sentenced Jones to 80 years in prison, with no possibility of parole until 2095, when he would be well over 140 years old. He will die in prison. Outside the courthouse, Sandy told reporters something that captures grief better than any speech. It's a joyful day and a very sad day. And then, quietly, now maybe, she could go home and try to be a real person again, whatever that is. The prosecutor who saw the case through, State's Attorney Robert Berlin, called the murder a black cloud that had hung over the county since 1985, a cloud that had finally lifted. And the loop that this whole story traces finally closed. A law inspired in part by Kristy's unsolved murder had captured Kristy's own murderer. The case solved itself with a tool it had helped create. It just needed 30 years, 1 domestic violence arrest, and a database that never stops comparing. But I told you to remember Dana Henry, and I keep my promises. Henry was there, in that courtroom, watching the real killer be sentenced. The man whose life had been dismantled by suspicion, the jail cell, the $50,000, the lost house, the lost friends, came hoping that seeing justice done would finally let him heal. It didn't. The day after the sentencing, he broke 30 years of silence and told reporters the truth nobody wanted to hear on a day of celebration. He had never even met Kristy Wesselman. And in 3 decades, not one person from the police department had ever apologized to him. No acknowledgement, no consequences for anyone. The system that finally delivered justice for Kristy never so much as glanced back at the other life it wrecked on the way. So this case leaves us with a ledger that doesn't quite balance. A killer who will die in prison, but who was only free to kill because he served 6 years of a 10 to 20 sentence. A groundbreaking law that solved the murder, passed 17 years too late to prevent it. A mother who got her answer after 30 years of phone calls. And an innocent man who got his name back, though he never got his life back. And one small thing was never recovered at all. The ring Kristy was wearing that day has, as far as anyone knows, never been found. Somewhere out there, it still exists. One last unanswered question in a case that took 30 years to answer the biggest one. The landscape has moved on, the way landscapes do. The jewel where a security camera caught the last images of Kristy is gone. The building is a banquet hall now. The kids who used the shortcut are in their 50s, the age she would be. Places, it turns out, heal faster than people do. The field is just a field again, at least to everyone except the people who remember why, for 30 years, it wasn't. If this story meant something to you, the like button costs you nothing, and it helps Kristy's story, and Dana Henry's, reach people who have never heard their names. So here's the question I asked you in the middle of this video. Dana Henry refused to hand over his DNA, and it cost him everything, even though he was innocent. Was his refusal a red flag police were right to pursue, or exactly the right of a free citizen, and proof of how dangerous suspicion can be? Tell me where you land in the comments. I genuinely think this one splits people down the middle, and if you want another case researched and told like this one, the next video is on your screen right now. Kristy Wesselman would be in her 50s today. Take care of each other. I'll see you there.